I suddenly realized as I walked in today and saw you all that I'm talking to a hopelessly biased audience on this topic. I mean, what I'd like to do, this is fairly straightforward. I'd like you to put up your right hand if you're, like me, of course, in perfect shape. And if you've come here on a bicycle. I've done neither. Oh, so I'm wrong. You're not quite as hopelessly out of touch with reality as I thought. I want to talk about, actually this is quite relevant to what will come, because I think that what we're talking about is, as Francesco has just put across in his marvelous display of completely novel data, as far as I'm concerned, we're dealing with something which is an enormous challenge. And I think it's an even bigger challenge than that which normally occurs in specific aspects of nutrition. I hope I'll be able to explain. You're going to get a lot of people referring to these reports. Most people, are very scientific and they concentrate on the left and the enormous, mind-bending, systematic reviews and so on. Actually, the policy stuff, which I didn't really contribute much to either report. But the policy one, if you look at the detail, it's really quite fascinating, and I'll touch on some of those aspects in a few moments. Obesity. Everybody knows, you die if you're very fat earlier. Here actually are the latest data from the prospective collaborative study involving enormous numbers, and please understand, dealing with mortality only. And that actually is a reinforcement of what we specified in this building 27 years ago, when we absolutely confirmed that BMI 25, at that stage based on US insurance statistics and the build and blood pressure study, that it still applies if you take, of course, this is cardiovascular and total mortality. This is total mortality. And you can see there's 25, there's 30. These are predominantly Western societies that have been used in these data, which is in fact relevant. Now, I was expected, I guess, to give a whole analysis of obesity across the world. Let me just highlight a crude overview. And I've deliberately taken women because, of course, as you realize, that remarkable 50% of society has been neglected in most studies until quite recently. And we all know that it's North America that's the sort of overwhelmingly obese, shown in red, and overweight in blue. Actually, that's no longer true. Here's the Middle East. And if you look at each one of these goes up from, these are the young, 18 to 29, 30 to 44, going up into middle age, 60, well, I now call 70 plus middle age, but 45 to 60 to 69. In fact, it's progressive everywhere you look. And you even now see this coming through in Africa. So we're dealing with a global phenomenon. And the question is, how are we going to cope with that? Francesco talked about the astonishing changes occurring in lower income countries. And I thought it would be useful to take from the report Barry Hopkins data showing this is the annual increase in prevalence. And here we are, there's the US, but here's Mexico, Brazil, Morocco, Thailand, China, Indonesia. I mean, it's exploding everywhere. And in fact, Barry Hopkins got a whole series of papers coming out suggesting that although we seem to have just about put a lid on the epidemic at a phenomenal level in the United States, and there may be a turn down in children in Europe, elsewhere it's out of control, and with the rates going up faster in the so-called developing world, lower and middle income countries, than in affluent societies. And one of the dilemmas that we've got, and it's a bit embarrassing, is to think about, I've just shown you the regional data, but actually if you look at national data, and this is a crude, not age standardized set of data that we put together some time ago, but we all know that it's the best food is in the Mediterranean world, until you find, of course, that Greece is top of the list. And actually, if you look at children, it's all the Mediterranean countries that are the fattest. And that, in fact, is almost certainly because the Mediterranean diet is disappearing in the Mediterranean countries. Now, why in our first report, when we looked at the data, did we pick up a bit on BMI and obesity? But it's now come through extremely powerfully. In fact, one of the most, I think is probably true, Martin, one of the most consistent set of data emerging from the systematic reviews in that second analysis. Well, part of it is that it's very easy, comparatively, to measure heights and weights. It's much more difficult to measure diet and physical activity. And that's one of the big issues we might touch on in questions. But the other thing, of course, is there's been an astonishing change in circumstances over the last 20 to 30 years. And I think one of the most amazing sets of data, I use it quite often now, are these Australian data using excellent data over a 100-year time span, and using the identical system of analysis. There are different methods of classification. This is the ITF one. And look at the takeoff from 85. And if you look around the world, and this is happening in every region, I've just taken some examples from the different regions, you find that actually it takes off in 85 in Western societies and about 90 or so in the lower income countries. So we're dealing with a societal phenomenon and not just the fact that I'm becoming lazy and hopeless of controlling my weight. And here's our analysis, which I think actually we need to update because it's all of a couple of years ago, where in practice we're now dealing with 1 in 10 of all children in the world who are overweight using perfectly reasonable criteria that would be agreed by most people. And of course, again, it varies. And here, the North American data are long established. I'm not going to really talk about socioeconomic differences because you're going to hear that from Sir Michael Marmot. But actually, this actually simply shows that we've got to think about that. And the latest analyses, a whole series of papers coming out, suggesting that we get this strange increase in obesity as people get more wealthy in very poor countries. Not so strange if you think about the mechanisms. And it then tends to go in reverse in more affluent societies. And I hope that you'll discuss that a bit later on. Now, what I want to emphasize is that if we think about morbidity, I've shown you the BMI 25, which we took in the 1983 Royal College report. And actually, we'd already got close to that in 76 with the MRC report. But if you look at the disease burden, we're talking about increasing risks from a much lower level. And actually, we horrified WHO at the turn of the century when we calculated that the ideal average BMI of a population should be 21. And now there'll be papers coming out in a few weeks or months which will question whether in fact that ideal number should be somewhat lower for some societies because of the huge burden of disease which we now see apparent, for example, in Asia, on an increased risk per increment in BMI. I put in this colon cancer, which we added originally from a European analysis, and I'll come to that. But look at the astonishing increase in risk before we ever get out of the normal range. So if we're thinking about the weight issue, it's not a question of should we get down and reduce the obesity. Obesity, BMI 30 is hardly on the slide at all. And actually we're dealing with this, everybody says, well, it doesn't really matter. Actually, this makes a substantial contribution to the burden of ill health. And that therefore represents an even bigger challenge. And this is where the Asian and we, in Mexico, using national data, we came to the conclusion that actually the normal BMI should be, well, the so-called upper limit of so-called normal BMI should be lower at perhaps 23. Now, 10 years ago, when we tried to do and look at the impact of weight gain, we knew that we should include cancer. But we were so hopeless at analyzing the relationship on a mathematical basis across the world to the different cancers, and I've chosen this deliberately. When we take the European data, because that's where I could do it fairly easily, here we are, breast cancer, endometrial, and colon. We had these three, postmenopausal breast cancer, three relationships where we had some reasonable data on the gradient of risk, which we could use, and I'll show you later on. And this is actually a pretty small increment. It varies. Note that the Eastern Europe, Baltic, Hungary, these states as classified at that time, they had the biggest burden. But we now need to update that, and that's not yet been done in this context, and I'll come to that. So in the second report, you all know, I guess, that these are the analyses, and we came up with these cancers, both convincingly and probable effects, and on that basis, we decided to go for policy. Fine. But, you know, when you do all these studies, everybody always says, well, you know, it's these epidemiologists like my good friend Elio, just making these wild assumptions about associations, and, you know, you're not really dealing with causal effects. Well, one of the intriguing sets of data, I know it's bizarre, but if you take people who are extremely obese and you operate on them with bariatric surgery, and then you compare them with people who've not had the bariatric surgery, and this I'm showing you US studies, but I could show you the latest publications from the Swedish SOS study, you find something pretty astonishing. You find an amazing drop in the incidence of cancer as a result of the surgery. Now, that doesn't mean to say that weight itself is the fundamental factor. I think it's got a lot to do with it. But in many of these surgical cases, you're manipulating hormones in a completely bizarre way, the gut hormones and so on. And we don't know the precise mechanism, but it's coming through fairly consistently. The cancers are halved. And the most important thing is, this is not, you know, we talk about the cancer process taking 15, 20, 25, 30 years. But actually, if you have you get an impact which is so self-evident, it's statistically significant, when in fact you've only gone for a period of 5 to 7 years. And that has all sorts of implications in terms of the potential benefit if you could only cope with the cancer problem. Francesco's already shown you the epidemic of cancer, and here's from the WCRF report, new cases predicted to go up sky high, and also with deaths. Now, I've just mentioned the flexibility of the cancer process. One of the most intriguing sets of data, and this is from Larry Colonel, one of the major contributors to the WCRF reports, is the amazing change, reduction in stomach cancer and the increasing rates of colon and breast cancer. And you see this for Japan again. And over a period of only 15, 18 years. So I always thought that we'd have enormous problems. You'd have to implement policies and expect an effect in 30 years' time. And how are we going to play this game with politicians and others, and I'll come to that later on, where they always want something done in 3 to 5 years? It's quite a problem. Now, I thought that if I used this slide much more, I'd be beaten up by my friends from Prakash Shetty's old center. But it illustrates beautifully, and it's this and many other studies are meant to be published, and I was told were being published 4 years ago. Don't know what's happened. There are now about 20 countries involved. But here's a beautiful analysis of what's happening in the world during this so-called nutrition transition. And you're taking people from Karnataka, from rural parts close to Bangalore, and you're comparing them with their cousins, brothers, sisters, who now live in Bangalore. And the question is, what's their state of play? And look at the huge increase in the average BMI. And they've only been transferred over a period of, say, 10 years. And the rates of overweight or obesity have gone up 5 to 10-fold. And if you then look at the nature of the diet, and Francesco is talking about that, trebling of fat, up 5-fold or more on sugar, salt up 4-fold, and look at activity. Physical activity drops profoundly as you go into the cities. So we're dealing with physical activity, a dramatic change in nutrition, and also a huge escalation of obesity. And that's what's happening as we shift everybody, essentially, into an urban environment in most societies around the world. And for what it's worth, they haven't got cancer rates. They may be able to get that data fairly soon because they have such a huge data set. Look at the huge increases in diabetes, in hypertension, and indeed in cardiovascular disease. Now, Ricardo Wowie is in a few minutes going to talk about the whole issue of looking at the life cycle. And he and I concocted this report, this diagram in Aberdeen, highlighting the fact that if you're looking at a process of well-being in a society, you have to think about the pregnant women, about the babes, the children, and indeed the elderly. And in fact, one now has to think about what is going on in terms of imprinting, in terms of the genetic construct with which we're born. And it's pretty clear that if you look at the nutrition transition and the westernization of societies, we bring children up completely inappropriately. And that's leading to a whole host of problems. And in fact, as we change the diet, we get the cancers and so on coming through powerfully. This is an enormous challenge with a life cycle, which therefore means that we are locking in processes where we have to cope on a very long-term basis. So, let's come to cancer. When you look at the data, I was extremely cynical about what we could actually find out. But those of you, and I've just taken this to show that if you put together data, it's pretty clear that you do get this gradient of risk using cohort studies, which were the preferred studies. And then the issue is, okay, you get a gradient of risk. How can you then let's look at physical activity. And which aspect of physical activity do you use? I shouldn't be saying it, but most of the analyses on physical activity use questionnaires. And if you go to the sophisticated meetings on physical activity now, they're demanding brilliant new accelerometry analyses of population groups using very simple accelerometers. Nevertheless, let's just cope with the inexact questionnaire data. Actually, you get pretty reasonable data if you think about occupation, and you notice that actually, if you have high occupational activity, you have a lower risk of colorectal cancer. Whereas it's much more difficult to look at recreational physical activity, actually. I mean, I tell everybody that I exercise and my 10,000 counts, of course, click up every day, which is untrue. Actually, it's very difficult to get a reasonable impact. And then, of course, if you look at it, in people with high BMI, it's difficult to see an impact of recreational physical activity. Maybe it's different in those with low BMI. But we have this interaction, and that's extremely difficult to unravel. That does not mean to say, as I'll show you, that physical inactivity is not important. Breast cancer. You all know, most people are always impressed by how, albeit tight, how small the increment of risk is. But when you think about the huge numbers involved, That's really very important. And here's the pancreatic. I mean, it's just amazing to me, not being involved in that analysis, fortunately, how well and clear the data came through. And here's the adenocarcinoma, where I think this is one of the cancers where the sheer physical impact of obesity with regurgitation and so on of acid seems to be etiologically important. Now, okay, so the data are actually better than we've ever had. And we now are coming up with the fact that it's making a big contribution to the global burden. But here's the latest analysis by WHO of the risk factors and what's contributing in high-income countries to the chronic burden of premature death, and much more important, up to 5 to 10 times more important, the burden of ill health before you die. We've always been talking about mortality. Actually, the burden of ill health is far more important than premature mortality. So, when we go into the mechanism, you can see this in the report. You can have a wonderful time trying to work out how this process of obesity and physical inactivity locks into other aspects of food and involves different aspects of the carcinogenic process. And what I thought I'd do is just take, this is from the report, the second report, and if you take the beginning of a normal cell, and we'll hear about fetal exposure shortly, body compositional changes, cell proliferation, carcinogenesis, and I'll come to the rest of it. And then you say, where does obesity come in? Actually, it's astonishing. There's inflammation, obesity now being seen as an inflammatory disease, which we can discuss if you like. And even if you go further on, and you know the implication of prevention within a 5 to 7 year period, is that are you locking in a pretty late part of the process? This is an incomplete understanding, by definition, of the process. And I think it's fair to say the physical inactivity and obesity, how it operates in that, I was going to say cascade of events, is still unclear and is part of the research agenda. Now, we had pitiful estimates of preventability of cancer 10 years ago. Here are the latest data, and I've extracted this from the second policy report and used data from the appendix. And here's America, US, UK, Brazil, China. And I've just taken a few, this is postmenopausal breast cancer, of cancers that relate. And this is the preventability, not simply from physical activity and obesity, but from the whole game. And I've just inserted for colorectal physical activity, which seems to be more important than obesity, whereas in breast cancer, I've put in body fatness, as the overweight is termed. And that is roughly the same for physical activity. So actually, it's dietary factors, physical activity, and fatness. They, I mean, roughly speaking, they all contribute substantially. And how we stack that up is a big challenge. But the implication is, this is not small beer we're talking about. This is big stuff. Okay, so where are we going? Francesco's talked about the major challenges. Let me emphasize something. What we're doing in the world is we've got gigantic economic forces making sure that we don't have to do any physical activity at all. I mean, you earn, I bet you earn most of your living doing practically nothing except dabbing on a computer button. I mean, it's ridiculous. In fact, we could be, some of you must be maybe millionaires, and you hardly need to get out of bed. So logically, we ought to be eating far less than we ever did before. And that implies that the quality doesn't have to be as good as it was. It has to be much better to have a lower energy and all the appropriate nutrients stacked into that lower energy intake. Okay, so how do we combat physical inactivity? Everybody says run around the block. and please run round the block. And I'll keep saying run round the block. And the way in which you change things is, as in Frankfurt or in the Netherlands, you alter the physical environment. Whereas here, it's a nightmare that Britain and America went down completely the wrong way, and Denmark and the Netherlands did the opposite. And you can see dramatic differences. It even relates to climate change. Not only have we got massive effects of industrial pressure on the physical activity, it's also on the food side. And the Australian Preventive Health Task Force said obesity is a commercial success. I mean, it's fantastic for selling food. You know, you need more food if you're obese. And you can read this in due course on the website. And I had to learn, not from crazy public health guys like myself, but from the top of 5 businesses. I asked them identical question. What's your biggest priority and how do you actually get bigger turnover? Marketing, price, availability. You've got to have the product reasonable. But these are the key things. And the highest priority for most Western food companies, identical responses within 20 seconds, penetrating the third world, as they called it. It is where their big profits have to come from. So we're into food wars, and those food wars not only between companies, but then also sometimes with public health people. And Karina Hawkes, that wonderful lady who used to work in IFPRI, she talks about the supermarkets as the food-consuming industry because they often determine not only what the farmers do, but frankly, what we eat. The evidence on children being confused by marketing is, of course, obvious and well recognized. I don't need to repeat it. What I'd like to see are much newer data which link to the analyses being done in the States, which show that only about, well, you're so brilliantly intelligent, 10% of your decisions on food purchases are based on an adequate, knowledgeable understanding of the nutrient content of foods. The analysis suggests that 95% of our decisions about this, that, or the other, for the most part, on a population basis, are made almost reflexly and subconsciously and have been conditioned by Gary Lineker and David Beckham and others. And it's very interesting that the chief scientist, when he was introducing the Foresight report, actually rocked the boat, and I'm still hoping that our newly crowned Prime Minister will read this report, because it's not an individual responsibility. They highlight that obesity is a normal, passive, biologically expected phenomenon in our environment. I could have talked about the genetics, I won't. They're important. But the overwhelming environmental issue is important, and as he specified in his launch, it reflects a failure of the free market. So if we're going to do things, we need to move fast. And we can take individual responsibility, or we can change the environment. We need to have both involved. But here's the physical inactivity. Beautiful data from Australia. Physically active, they go to the gym every day. But if they sit in front of the television afterwards and have the odd snack, look at the extraordinary increase in BMI. In fact, you know, it doesn't matter what physical activity you tend to do in your spare time. It's your total overall physical activity that will actually determine your BMI. And if you take Britain, we've actually, even recently, become ever more inactive. I know the bikes are coming back in London, but actually we haven't yet really touched the problem. And on a global basis, some things are inevitable as we move into cities, but a huge range of options affect automatically our physical activity. Now, you've all seen this Shariki diagram showing that if you tell somebody to, be active and choose properly, it's heavily influenced by a whole range of issues. in the WCRF report, and everybody then blames the other. And how can we make progress? And here this comes really from Boyd Swinburne, where you actually can look at the evidence. And if you look at the evidence of effectiveness, you can get something by persuading not only individuals, but industry to change, as in salt intakes in Britain. But you also need community interventions to get really high, good evidence for that, and a pretty reasonable impact. So the dilemma is as follows. Oh, that's just to show there's a turn down in obesity as a result of those things. But here is what Tim Lobstein presented to ministers of health from Mexico and Finland and many others last weekend in Helsinki. You are all up here, health professionals, advocacy groups and so on. You have a fantastic interest. And do you have any influence? They're bored out of their minds with us. And the question is, how are these guys? They have far more influence than we do. And they operate quite often in effect against our whole process. So in conclusion, if we're going to shift the whole strategy for how we do, we have to become far more coordinated. And that's why the WCRF report showed that all of us can be involved. And the question is, even if you're in the biological aspect of carcinogenesis, you have a role in supporting those people in public health, because we're never going to overcome this problem unless we take action soon. Thank you very much.